September 1st, 1983. A Korean Airlines 747 on a routine flight from Anchorage to Seoul drifts wildly off course over Soviet territory. Without provocation, a Soviet Air Force fighter shoots it down, killing all 269 persons on board. Secret Russian photos taken at the bottom of the Sea of Japan reveal the wreckage and the bodies strewn across the ocean floor. December 21st, 1988. A pre-Christmas flight to the U.S. ends in horror when a bomb aboard a Pan Am jumbo jet explodes in midair. The plane crashes in Lockerbie, Scotland. 270 are killed, setting off one of the biggest international manhunts ever. KAL 007 and Pan Am 103, two tragic flights of terror on this edition of the 20th century. I'm Mike Wallace. Back in 1983, every Saturday night, Korean Airlines Flight 007 left New York's John F. Kennedy Airport on a routine flight to Seoul, South Korea, with an intermediate stop in Anchorage, Alaska for refueling and a crew change. And that is what happened with KAL Flight 007 on the evening of August 31st, 1983. But 5 hours after leaving Anchorage, the 747, carrying 269 people, suddenly disappeared near the northern coast of Japan.
This is a CBS News special report.
It has been confirmed by the United States Department of State that a Soviet fighter plane has shot down a South Korean 747 jetliner from New York. All 269 people aboard the unarmed passenger plane are feared dead.
KAL 007, carrying 62 Americans, had strayed into Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island in the Russian Far East and crashed into the Sea of Japan.
The United States reacts with revulsion to this attack. Loss of life appears to be heavy. We can see no excuse whatsoever for this appalling act.
Relatives in Seoul who had gone to meet the plane feared the worst. The flight was delayed, long overdue. Even before Schultz's announcement, the Japanese pointed the finger at the Soviets and summoned Moscow's ambassador. Tokyo wanted some answers, but the Russians gave none.
The Soviet Union implicitly denied tonight that its fighters shot down a South Korean airliner. In a 10-line task statement read on the national TV newscast, the announcer said that an unidentified aircraft did violate Soviet airspace twice. He said the aircraft did not have navigation lights, did not respond to questions, and did not enter into contact with the dispatcher service. The Soviets reported earlier that a Korean airliner had been lost, but the latest statement seems to say that the Soviets had nothing to do with its disappearance. There is certainly no mention of the plane being shot down.
The Russian silence only deepened the mystery.
What was so important about this area to warrant a premeditated act of murder? The plane went down off the southern tip of the Soviet island of Sakhalin. The Pentagon officials say there is nothing of great strategic importance there.
But in fact, the Korean airliner had also passed over the Kamchatka Peninsula, home of a Russian nuclear submarine base.
They have many troops there, some very sensitive communications, and also a very important radar for Soviet anti-ballistic missile defense. I would say that this would be one of 2 or 3 most sensitive Soviet areas from the military standpoint.
It is Friday afternoon in Tokyo. The Soviet ambassador to Japan now is quoted as saying Soviet search parties have found, quote, the traces of an airline crash. Still, no official Soviet admission that a Russian pilot shot down the Korean Airlines 747 jetliner with up to 269 persons on board, but the first official Soviet acknowledgement that it was even looking for the plane.
What can be said about Soviet credibility when they so flagrantly lie about such a heinous act?
Finally, 2 days after the incident, the Soviet news agency TASS, speaking for the Soviet government, expressed regret for the loss of life.
TASS said that a Soviet jet fighter fired warning shots with tracer shells along the path of the airplane. The plane flew on, TASS said, but after 10 minutes, it could not be observed anymore by radio location means. TASS asks, why didn't the Americans, who now resort to all kinds of dirty insinuations about the USSR, not try to establish contact with the Soviet side and provide it with the necessary data about this plane?
The Soviets had good reason to ask, because both the Americans and the Russians routinely played a dangerous intelligence-gathering game over the Russian Far East.
U.S. officials now concede that an American spy plane was flying close to the Soviet Union at about the same time the Korean 747 strayed into Soviet airspace. So at least for a while, the Soviets probably thought they were tracking an American spy plane, not a commercial airliner.
While the U.S. combed the ocean looking for wreckage, some investigators speculated that KAL 007 had drifted because of pilot error in programming its navigation guidance system. But only the so-called black boxes crammed with flight data could confirm that, and the Russians refused to say whether they had recovered them.
As the search went on, and it became clear the plane was the victim of a Soviet attack, the world asked, was there a warning? The Soviets said yes, the airline said no.
As it turned out, this wasn't the first time the Soviets had problems with a straying Korean civilian airliner.
It happened once before. In 1978, a Korean passenger plane strayed over Soviet territory. Without warning, a Soviet jet opened fire, sending the Korean airliner into a screaming dive and a crash landing on a frozen lake. Miraculously, only 2 persons died.
That first intrusion deep into Soviet territory threw a scare into the Russians. Never again, they vowed, would they allow an aircraft to penetrate their airspace so deeply.
I believe in the wake of the 78 incident, the Soviets were so determined not to have another situation in which their air defense appeared to perform so poorly, and that they set up not only a lot more investment in the air defense system, but more rigid controls.
Later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was revealed that the Soviets had implemented a much tougher policy on intruding aircraft. The new orders gave Soviet air defense commanders no discretion and allowed no exceptions for lost or straying airliners. The orders were, shoot first, ask questions later. Within days of the shoot-down, anti-Soviet demonstrations broke out in South Korea.
Over and over, it was the same. The Russians are barbarous, are murderers, chanted this downtown crowd as the Russian flag burned. The protest rallies continue and continue to grow. 2,000 at this one. More than that at a boys' senior high school. Chants, yes, but also silence for a nation's grief. President Chun joined relatives of the dead at a memorial service held in Seoul's Kempo Airport. The living bringing with them pictures of the dead. Korean airline officials came to bow, to apologize at this woman's house. She could only cry out, "Why are you here without my son? Who took my son?"
And from the United States, more hardline rhetoric.
It was an act of barbarism, born of a society which wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life, and seeks constantly to expand and dominate other nations.
A bitter, slanderous attack against the Soviet Union is how Radio Moscow describes President Reagan's address to the nation last night. He urged Congress, the radio said, to approve giant military programs using the Korean airliner incident as a pretext. The Soviets still deny shooting down the Korean airliner.
But on September 6th, 5 days after the plane went down, UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick made it impossible for the Russians to go on denying the shooting down by playing a Japanese intercepted recording of the Soviet fighter pilots pursuing a defenseless KAL 007.
Yes, I'm approaching the target. I'm going in closer. The target's strobe light is blinking. I've already approached the target to a distance of about 2 kilometers. ZG, missile warheads locked on. I've executed the launch. The target is destroyed.
Moscow had been insisting that the Korean plane could not be identified and was flying without lights. In this and other key points, Kirkpatrick declared the Soviets were lying.
Contrary to what the Soviets have repeatedly stated, The interceptor pilot saw the airliner's navigation lights and reported that fact to the ground on 3 occasions.
Just hours later, Moscow admitted what was all too obvious. The Soviet Union was responsible.
The interceptor fighter plane of the anti-aircraft defenses fulfilled the order of the command post to terminate the flight of the Korean airliner. It was the first full admission by the Kremlin that it had shot down the passenger plane with 269 people on board. The announcer went on to say, the Soviet pilots, in stopping the actions of the intruder plane, could not know that it was a civilian aircraft.
Retaliation varied. Many commercial airline pilots boycotted flights to Moscow for 60 days. President Reagan closed down all offices of the Soviet national airline, Aeroflot, in the U.S. In a face-to-face meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko in Madrid on September 8th, Secretary of State George Shultz demanded straight answers, but he got none.
Foreign Minister Gromyko made matters even worse by claiming that his country had the right to do what it did and has the right to do it again.
And then, a day after Madrid, the Soviets offered a full-throated defense for the attack on Flight 007.
It was clearly days in the preparation. With detailed maps and charts, Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the General Staff, the top uniformed officer in the Soviet military, explaining the bottom line. That there was no doubt this was a spy plane on a premeditated, thoroughly planned intelligence operation by the United States and Japan.
To back up the claim, the authorities produced the pilot who pulled the trigger, Gennady Osipovich, who said there were no signs of any lights on the Korean airliner.
I was certain that this enemy aircraft, which had broken into our territory, was flying over my home. People were sleeping, and he was up there on a spy mission.
Meantime, while the charges and countercharges continued, bodies and physical debris from the plane washed ashore in northern Japan. Soviet, American, and Japanese ships crisscrossed the waters, searching for those vital black boxes.
For security reasons, the Soviets normally strictly prohibit photography in their harbors and ports. But they did not raise objection when a crewman of the Japanese vessel Tsugaru videotaped these scenes as the ship arrived on Sakhalin Island to pick up debris from the Korean jetliner. He was able to see the port commander greet the 3 American and 4 Japanese officials with smiles and handshakes, and then watch as they headed off to retrieve what turned out to be 76 carefully cataloged objects from the plane.
The Japanese and Americans left the Soviet fishing port disappointed and openly skeptical. The Japanese have recovered 10 times the amount of debris from their shores much farther away from the crash site. Said one American, they said it was everything, adding, "But do you believe in Santa Claus?"
3 months passed, 6 months, then a year. Still no more from the Soviet Union about what had really happened. The silence only deepened the sense of despair felt by the victims' families.
1 full year since the Soviets shot Flight 007 into the sea, the pain felt by the families of the victims is still so great. For the families, there is too much mystery to this watery death. They have few answers about their loved ones, so they can only try to communicate. "Please protect us," one girl called to her father. "Are you cold out there?" one father asked his son. The South Koreans built this monument to give the KAL tragedy some finality, a closing chapter. But for many relatives, it hasn't worked. To them, the monument represents an act so outrageous, nothing about it should be final.
The political and social atmosphere in the Soviet Union shifted dramatically near the end of the 1980s as Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev initiated economic and social changes that opened its secretive society to the West. The downing of KAL 007, the incident the Soviets tried desperately to keep in the dark, was suddenly bathed in the new light of glasnost, openness. In December of 1990, the Soviet Union and South Korea re-established diplomatic relations after a 7-year hiatus caused by the shoot-down of Flight 007. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, Soviet officials apologized to South Korea for the downing of the airliner. In January of 1991, a series of articles in the Soviet state newspaper Izvestia revealed that the Soviets had found the wreckage of KAL 007 and had kept the discovery a secret. But in the new era of glasnost, Russian journalist Andrei Ilyich, after investigating the incident for 7 long years, was finally free to report the truth.
These were shocking photographs because the official version of the government was that we didn't find any plane.
Soviet divers had found the plane in October of 1983 off the coast of Sakhalin Island. Most of these pictures, gathered or filmed by Ilyich for his investigation, have never before been broadcast in the United States.
There are no other records of people being found. There are accounts by fishermen who found what looked like bits of body in their nets, but no corpses.
Crabs and other sea life had eaten much of the wreckage and remains of Flight 007, and much of what was recovered from the plane was either hidden or destroyed by the Russian army.
A pit was dug. The items put in the pit set on fire, then burned up. We dug one of these pits up. Some metallic parts had survived, but most personal belongings hadn't. Here are knives and forks with the emblem proving that they were from this particular airplane. Some life jackets. All I needed were a few things to prove they were from this airplane.
Ilyich reported that the Soviets had also discovered the coveted black boxes and had kept them hidden in the archives of the KGB for 9 years. Mikhail Gorbachev's successor, Boris Yeltsin, then went one step further toward divulging the truth about Flight 007.
In Seoul, a gesture by visiting Russian President Boris Yeltsin to foster ties with South Korea. Yeltsin returned flight recorders from Korean Airlines Flight 007, shot down by a Soviet warplane 9 years ago.
The flight recorders, along with tape recordings and documents, were turned over to the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. What came out of the black boxes in the subsequent ICAO report of May of 1993 finally revealed to the world the truth of the KAL tragedy. According to the flight data recorder, the captain of the plane had never engaged the navigational guidance system to his autopilot after the takeoff from Anchorage. He never turned it on. As a result, Flight 007 was in trouble as early as 10 minutes into the flight, straying off course toward a rendezvous with disaster. Some 3 hours after takeoff, 007 crossed the track of an American reconnaissance plane that had been flying near the Kamchatka Peninsula. Soon after that American plane left Soviet radar, another blip appeared in the area and was assigned the very same track number. Soviet air defense officers apparently thought the blip was the American plane once again, the reconnaissance plane, though in fact that blip was KAL 007. At about 2 a.m. Tokyo time, the Korean airliner crossed over Kamchatka Peninsula, where some Soviet radar stations were not working. 007 drifted in, then out of Soviet airspace. 3:11 a.m. 007 passes over Sakhalin Island. Soviet fighters scramble to intercept. 3:18 a.m. The Soviet Su-15 fighter approaches KAL-007 from behind and reports seeing the flashing navigation lights of an aircraft. 3:20. The Su-15 approaches the jumbo jet from the right side and fires a cautionary burst of cannon shells, but the warning goes unnoticed by the crew of 007. Soviet ground control has to act quickly. The intruder is almost out of Soviet airspace. 3:25. Acting on a command to destroy the target, the Soviet pilot then launches 2 missiles at the Korean airliner.
The target is destroyed.
It takes 12 minutes for Flight 007 to fall into the sea. All 269 persons aboard, including 62 Americans, are killed. According to the ICAO report, the flight crew of KAL Flight 007 never even knew they were off course. In a letter made public by Izvestia in 1992, the KGB advised Soviet Premier Yuri Andropov in 1983 that there was no proof KAL-007 was a spy plane, and they recommended that all evidence be kept secret. The document implicated Andropov in a massive cover-up. But Andropov was not alone.
Everyone in this story is guilty. The tragedy turned into a farce, a verbal and political war between Russia and the U.S. And in the Far East, into this field of hatred occupied by military submarines, Russian and U.S. ships, spy planes, the civilian aircraft came. And since the plane didn't play by the rules, it was doomed to be destroyed.
During the 40 years of the Cold War, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union stood toe-to-toe, ready to annihilate each other in just a few minutes of nuclear warfare, an incident like the downing of KAL-007 was probably inevitable. 3 elements came together to seal the fate of those 269 people. First, the tension between the 2 superpowers, each armed with a sophisticated air defense system, each with a finger on the trigger. Second, the rigid Soviet state border laws, where local commanders in effect had strict orders to shoot first and ask questions later. And third, the navigation error that allowed the 747 to stray off course away from Seoul and over Soviet territory. Virtually from the moment it took off from Anchorage, KAL-007 was doomed. 5 years later, the world was shocked yet again when another civilian airliner, a Pan Am 747 en route to New York, was destroyed over Scotland by a bomb planted by Middle East terrorists.
A gruesome Christmas-time disaster tonight. A quiet Scottish village, an inferno of flames after a Pan-American jumbo jet, homeward bound across the Atlantic, went off the radar and went down in the village center.
The normal flight path of Pan Am 103 would have taken it due west, over the Irish Sea. But on this night, weather forced the plane to fly north over land. And that is the only reason we ever learned what happened in the skies over the town of Lockerbie.
The wreckage of the worst air disaster in British history was scattered over 18 miles. The small Scottish village of Lockerbie burst into flames when debris rained down after the sky cracked with what one eyewitness called an almighty bang.
I heard this horrible sound. It was like a rushing and a screaming noise, and the whole sky just lit up.
Oh my God, it's terrible. And then sparks, and then the whole thing went down.
A ball of fire went, 300 feet in the air and then mushroomed out. We thought it was a nuclear explosion.
Well, you tell me where the plane is. There's nothing left. Nothing at all. Just pieces.
Rescue workers here do not expect that any of the persons reported on board Pan Am 103 survived. The crash site cut a wide swath through this little farming town. It looks like the plane just exploded and its wreckage rained down on Lockerbie in the middle of a cold Scottish night. Shards of metal pierced through roofs and walls. Parts of the plane left a crater about 15 feet deep in one spot. Glass, airplane parts, they're scattered all over the streets in the worst hit areas.
259 passengers were on board, 187 of them Americans, including 37 students from Syracuse University flying home for the holidays from their studies in England.
Oh, my baby!
From the beginning, the cause of the crash was a mystery. Investigators ruled out a collision because there were no other aircraft in the vicinity. There was no warning from the crew, no mayday call. Some experts speculated the crash could have been caused by massive mechanical failure. Others had a more sinister theory, a bomb.
It's the sweeping trail of debris scattered over the Scottish countryside that's convinced many experts that Flight 103 was blown apart. In daylight today, investigators followed an eerie path of destruction. Seat cushions and oxygen masks in the streets, a briefcase, and bodies strewn for miles. Cabin doors landed miles away in Langholm, and clothing was found near Westerkirk. Today, a helicopter search crew discovered perhaps the most valuable piece of evidence, the plane's in-flight recording equipment. Investigators hope the black box will reveal what happened here last night. Before it crashed in the Scottish hills, Pan Am Flight 103 was on course, on schedule, and gave no signal of distress.
Amid the growing talk of sabotage as the possible cause of the Pan Am 103 disaster, this much is known, fact. The U.S. State Department was forced to admit today it knew and warned its own embassies 2.5 weeks ago of a bomb threat against Pan Am jetliners bound from Frankfurt to New York.
On December 5, 1988, an unidentified individual telephoned the U.S. Embassy in Helsinki and stated that sometime within the next 2 weeks there would be a bombing attempt against a Pan American aircraft flying from Frankfurt to the U.S.
Finnish authorities had in fact interviewed the man who made the call, but they said the call was a hoax.
Hoax or no hoax, the U.S. government took the Helsinki threat seriously. The State Department admits it sent warnings to the FAA and to every U.S. embassy in Europe, but it did not warn U.S. servicemen and decided to say nothing in public.
The failure to make the warning public set off a firestorm of criticism.
Such a public statement with nothing more to go on than an anonymous telephone call, you'd literally have closed down the air traffic in the world.
But that explanation did little to assuage the grief of the passengers' relatives.
Siobhan Mulroy's house is full of empty Christmas stockings. Her father and 5 other family members died. She wondered why they weren't warned of the threats.
I mean, why did they do this? Was it for profit? I mean, were they afraid that they would lose flights? Were they afraid that they would lose passengers?
Security procedures mandated by the Federal Aviation Administration and in force at Pan Am came under intense public scrutiny, especially at Frankfurt Airport, where Flight 103 began.
The FAA says it did respond to the threat, but security was stepped up at Frankfurt Airport.
Pan Am, for instance, x-rayed all checked baggage, hand-checked all carry-on baggage, notified all their counter and gate personnel.
But at the Frankfurt check-in for Pan Am Flight 103 today, none of the checked baggage was x-rayed for bombs. The security check, which Pan Am officials insist is adequate, is based on checking boarding passengers against luggage, one body matched to every bag. If the bomb got on board Wednesday's ill-fated Flight 103, it probably went through this kind of security check.
The investigators remained baffled.
The first reports from Pan Am 103's black box, the cockpit's gauges were normal, warning lights off, and conversation routine. The flight's voice recorder registered a single unusual noise, and then there was nothing, as the plane broke up at 31,000 feet. While experts were carefully studying that faint noise today, rescue workers removed the bodies of a flight crew that never had the chance to call for help. British analysts say the abrupt shutdown of the black box recordings points to either massive structural failure or a bomb.
As the investigation continued, the painstaking work of recovering the remains of those aboard Flight 103 went on.
The rhythmic rotation of helicopter blades on the Scottish hillside meant that the remains of another passenger had been found this Christmas Eve. 239 bodies have now been recovered, and police today extended the range of their search more than 15 miles outside of Lockerbie.
Compounding the tragedy were the victims in Lockerbie itself. The devastation to the town was so widespread that for a while, no one knew how many people had been killed. Instead of putting up a list of Christmas greetings, the town fathers asked residents to put their names on a sheet posted in Town Hall. It was the only sure way to identify who was alive and who was still missing.
On Christmas Eve, the people of Lockerbie were at last delivered some good news. 6 of their missing have been located alive. Along the main street, flowers began arriving outside the temporary mortuary in the town hall. One bouquet came with a message from a man lucky enough to get off the plane in London. To the little girl in the red dress who lies here, he wrote, who made my flight from Frankfurt such fun. You didn't deserve this.
In the end, Lockerbie buried 11 of its own. Some died in their cars. Others were caught just sitting at home when the plane crashed. The death toll had reached 270.
It was a week ago tonight that Flight 103 fell out of the sky, leaving a 100-mile trail of twisted wreckage and 270 victims. Today, investigators said the evidence was conclusive. It was a bomb.
British investigators determined that sophisticated plastic explosives had somehow been smuggled on board the aircraft.
The explosives residues recovered from the debris have been positively identified and are consistent with the use of a high-performance plastic explosive.
Investigators' first lead came when they found suitcases ripped with metal fragments. Scientific tests then detected traces of detonating explosive in 2 parts of the framework of the metal luggage hold. Search teams will continue gathering wreckage and debris, but airline engineers can now leave with a sigh of relief. Investigators have completely ruled out structural failure as a cause.
Today's bombs don't necessarily look like bombs. They may be lightweight, malleable plastics that can be molded into almost any deceptive shape.
People could strap it onto their legs. People can make the bottom of the soles of their shoes out of it. If they want to pack it in their luggage, they can roll it as flat as a sheet of newspaper.
There is speculation that the explosive used was Semtex, a Soviet military plastic that is especially lightweight, almost odorless, and hard to detect.
Investigators now believe that the bomb was most likely located in the forward luggage compartment of the Pan Am 747. Now, here is what investigators think happened. When the bomb went off, fragments penetrated the plane's skin, the floor, and seats, and hit some of the passengers as well. The shock wave from the bomb was so powerful, it rocked the whole plane and blasted the cockpit off, and indeed a large section of the cockpit came down in one piece, some distance away from the rest of the plane's wreckage.
The first bodies came home today, and we learned finally that it had been deliberate, that someone wanted to kill our wives, our husbands, our children.
Oh, God, what did you do to me?
With the cause determined, the investigation can now shift. Terrorism experts will take over from airline engineers to ask who planted the bomb and how it was smuggled on board.
Grieving relatives like George Williams, whose son died on the plane, insisted that the United States waste no time striking back at those responsible.
If they find it was a large organization in one of those countries to set that desert afire, it's the only thing, it's like the bully on the block. The only thing they understand is a 2x4 across the face.
Vice President George Bush and President Ronald Reagan promised swift retribution with a big if.
See card and punish firmly, decisively those who did this, if you can ever find them.
What we want to do is find out who did it and bring them to justice, you bet.
All the evidence screamed terrorists, highly skilled terrorists with enough sophistication to manufacture the bomb and then place it on board the plane without being detected. But which group could do it? And what was their motive?
The finger of suspicion is pointing at radical Palestinian groups, men who see violence as the only way to win back their homeland, and whose motive would in part be to wreck the chances of a negotiated settlement with Israel. Top of the list for the Pan Am outrage is Ahmed Jibril, Syrian-backed head of the radical Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, an anti-Arafat group.
But Jibril's organization wasn't the only suspect.
There are other candidates too, grainy specters like Abu Nidal, who sent condolences to the Pan Am 103 victims, but didn't deny guilt, and the even more shadowy Abu Ibrahim, master bomb maker of the vicious May 15 organization. This terror elite is protected by Arab leaders who have been accused of using terrorism as foreign policy.
Other theories surfaced. Maybe pro-Iranian groups were responsible. They certainly had a motive. In July of 1988, 5 months before the Lockerbie explosion, an Iranian commercial airliner had been shot down by mistake by a U.S. warship patrolling the Persian Gulf. All 290 on board were killed. Although Iran repeatedly denied having anything to do with what happened to Pan Am 103, their hatred for the U.S. was well known. Investigators decided to rebuild the plane to help them learn everything they could about the bomb. As the rebuilding continued, more details emerged, details about how and where the bomb got on board the plane.
Britain's chief investigator into the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 said today the bomb was smuggled on board in a radio cassette player. Searchers came to that conclusion after sifting through more than 10,000 pieces of the wreckage scattered around Lockerbie, Scotland. The chief detective also said today that the explosive was probably placed aboard in Frankfurt, where the flight originated and where there had been threats.
Often, as investigators tried to identify the culprits, leads that looked promising turned out to be blind alleys. Example, by April of 1984, detectives believed that a member of Jabril's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command had slipped a